Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Aisha Subarkash. After 7 weeks of fighting that has led to more than 14,800 deaths, both Israel and Hamas have agreed to a humanitarian pause. Hamas has just released the first group of Israeli hostages to cap the start of a 4-day truce in Gaza. 13 women and children who were taken hostage back on October 7 were handed over to the Red Cross before making their way back to Israel. This was the first phase of 50 hostages that are set to be released over the next 4 days under the deal. Israel, in exchange, will be releasing 150 Palestinian prisoners. Fighting had raged in the run-up to Friday's truce, with Israel launching hundreds of airstrikes, one of which reportedly hit a hospital inside Gaza City. As part of the temporary truce, more aid is expected to be allowed into the besieged enclave. Israel said the pause will be extended by a day for each additional batch of 10 hostages released. Hamas took 240 Israelis to Gaza during its attack on October 7, which was met with a devastating military response. And to further discuss the latest developments from Gaza, joining me now from Cape Town is Ebrahim Rasool. He's a former South African ambassador to US, and from Washington, D.C., William Lawrence. He's a former US diplomat. Gentlemen, welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you on the program. So, Ebrahim, what are the prospects of this limited truce between Israel and Hamas? I mean, are we at a real turning point in this conflict?
I think the most important achievement out of a very limited truce is that there is a truce at all. I think that it goes against the design of the Israeli state to not let up their assault on Gaza. It goes against the license it was given by particularly the United States. And so that we have a truce at all, just a humanitarian pause, is insufficient, but it is a great achievement. And so hopefully through that, some humanitarian aid can be gotten, some relief for the people of Gaza can be received in the form of water, electricity, food, internet connectivity, and so forth. And maybe this is the pause that the world needs to reassess the license it has given for the annihilation, particularly of Gaza, if not any prospect of peace in the land of the Middle East.
I'm going to ask about the international reaction to this, but William, Israel has also agreed to extend this deal if Hamas follows through. So is it likely to hold? How do you see it? How shaky is it? And what are the main challenges?
It's very shaky. It's very complex. The negotiators have reported publicly and privately that it's just about the most complex negotiation they've been involved in. There are hostages of at least 9 nationalities. They're letting out only the dual national Israelis today. And so, at what point are we getting into other nationalities? And then at what point are we getting into Israeli troops some of whom are being held by a different organization, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or still other organizations who have different demands in terms of the release of Palestinian prisoners. So there are a lot of things that could go wrong today. There are a lot of things that could go wrong over the next 3 days. I do believe this is an important step forward, if not the turning point. Of course, as you know, we've already had 4 hostages released. We've already had humanitarian pauses. But the scale and scope of this ceasefire is not anything anyone really predicted at this point. So hopefully we can build on it for a further de-escalation.
So Ebrahim, what do Israel and Hamas stand to gain from this hostage exchange? I mean, is it aimed at pleasing their own domestic audiences?
I think that they both need something out of this pause, and 50 kidnapped victims for 150 plus prisoners, especially women and children, I think is one that at least keeps their own supporters believing that the pause is working for them. Whether it is substantial enough to scale back the devastation, I don't think that can ever be done. And so really in that kind of sense, the world is gathering to be able to say, how can we make this pause longer, more substantial, and begin to scale back the devastation that is felt, particularly in Gaza.
So, William, Israel will reportedly release Palestinian women and children who were arrested mostly during anti-Israel protests that has been taking place since the October 7th attack. So how much of a difference does this make given the sheer number of Palestinians held in Israeli prisons? I mean, how will this contribute to the Palestinian cause?
It's creating hope among even the um, Palestinians who have family members who have multiple life sentences who are in jail, and so it's creating all kinds of hope, and that will also create all kinds of disappointment because we have north of 7,000 prisoners in Israeli jails, north of 1,200. With no charges. One of the things I've been saying is that there have to be some sort of guarantees that those who are released aren't immediately arrested again. As you know, there have been hundreds of arrests just in the last couple of weeks, and there's a risk that most of these prisoners are being released to the West Bank, not to Gaza, that they just get rearrested again with the next round of Israeli operations. But as my colleague is saying, there's an important let's say, demonstration effect and momentum that could be created domestically for the Israelis and internationally if this works. And so, assuming that these next 3 days go well, we could be in a position for further de-escalations. And one of the ironies being, if I could just add, the U.S. strategy from the beginning, for better or for worse, was to bear hug the Israelis and then try to walk them back from the worst of what they would do. Both of those things sort of happened, although it was atrocious, obviously what happened. But that, unfortunately, for Israel to walk back further, there'll need to be, to some degree, more bear hugging, not just finger wagging from the Americans and the Western countries in particular, those who abstained at the UN, if you want a list. And that there'll have to be some sort of guarantee, for both sides of a protection of their civilians. And we are far from that. The level of trust on both sides right now is abysmally low.
So what would you say, Ebrahim, what do you make of the international community's response to this latest truce, especially the US's allies, which have been fully supporting Israel's right to self-defense since day one? Has it changed?
I think what has changed, and that helps the US and its allies in justifying and sustaining this truce and the ceasefire, is that their own populations have begun to protest against the blank check that was given, protest against the scale of Israeli destruction, the scale of Palestinian lives lost, which have been far beyond the initial, in this round at least, the initial deaths amongst the Israelis. And so the US is also getting a pause from sustained protest and pressure from its own populations and criticism from across the world. And they also know that the case has been building against normalization by the Arab regimes with Israel. And so if this very expensive strategy by Hamas has any results, it is that it has either made normalization between Arabs and the Israeli state impossible, if not extremely difficult. And so that may be, from a point of view of solidarity, that may be the greatest gain out of what has happened in the last few days.
But let's, William, talk about the public reaction. I mean, how have the mounting public reaction to mostly Western governments' pro-Israeli stance played out so far? Despite excessive restrictions, have they been able to change their government's position over what's been happening in Gaza?
Not enough, but what's been astounding to me is how quickly popular protests against a war, something we often see in these Western democratic contexts, has translated to negative poll numbers for President Biden in the US and similar phenomenon in the UK, France, et cetera. That the populations are not only saying they're against the war, they're saying they will not vote for these heads of state. They will not vote for these politicians. And the level of cantankerousness in the parliaments as well, with the sanctioning of the only Palestinian American congressperson, et cetera, have been unprecedented. So that level of deep division in domestic, the domestic view of what's going on in Israel is quite profound in the United States. Whether it will change the posture, we're not there yet. We have an opportunity, as my colleague in South Africa said, but I don't think at this point there's been a full revision, let's say, of the Israeli strategy with Western backing, in part because there never was a plan. They just rolled out the playbook from 2014 and 2021 of death and destruction, and then the West waving their arms and asking or telling Israel to put on the brakes, and that seems to be in a repeat mode of that type of overreaction and then breaking of the overreaction rather than an actual strategy with a sustainable solution.
So, Ebrahim, your country, South Africa, has recently decided to shut down the Israeli embassy and suspend all ties with Israel until hostilities are brought to an end. How has it resonated in your country, and what will it take for your country to turn things to normal?
I think it's going to be very difficult to get things to normal. You know, the notion of Israel being the successor apartheid state to the South African apartheid state is one of the issues that South Africa has borrowed to the Palestinians. So the resonance is very strong, and in fact, it almost believes that the Israeli apartheid is infinitely worse than whatever we have experienced. We have not had carpet bombing of even Soweto in South Africa. So I think the president is actually trying to tamp down the demands of both the population and of parliament. And so in Qatar, the president was referring the matter of the Israeli war crimes to the ICC. Parliament has suspended the Israeli embassy's activities. South African diplomats were recalled from Tel Aviv, and the Israeli ambassador was demarched and then called back to Tel Aviv. And so all of this is really finding enormous resonance in South Africa. And what South Africa has been able to do was to make that also part of what the BRICS world is now beginning to understand. And so suddenly, from South Africa, you now have a BRICS alliance that has in excess of 40% of the world's population and in excess of 30% of the world's GDP, including 4 Middle Eastern states, all beginning to sing out of the same hymn book in order, I think, to make sure that not only do we stop this round of war, but that there is a very decisive move to a lasting solution. It's still speaking the language of a two-state solution within the 67 borders, but I think that they will assess the degree of impossibility of this two-state solution given the prevalence of settlements that is in the second state that ought to be Palestinian.
All right, gentlemen, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.